Hello there, and welcome to the Second Life Book Club. My name is Draxtor Dupre. As you can see, we are underwater today because Ray Nayler is in the house. Ray Nayler is the author of the absolutely fascinating debut novel, The Mountain in the Sea. It's an amazing novel about. I struggled with the 12-second elevator pitch. It's a first contact of sorts with an alien species, and the alien species is happens to be an octopus or octopuses. The book is also about AI in various different forms. To me, one of the strong themes is also late stage capitalism. There's an amazing plot that has to do with an AI freighter that harvests seafood, fish, and there are basically slaves on board, but the entire ship is operated by an AI, and there's a mutiny on the ship. I mean, it's amazing. There are many, many big themes. There's a lot of action going on as well. Ray Nayler has written a whole bunch of short stories. In his real life, he is also currently, according to his website, the international advisor to the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And we welcome Ray here to the book club. Hello, Ray.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's really wonderful to be here. It's an honor. And thanks for setting up this beautiful place. It's gorgeous, like a perfect place to talk about the mountain and the sea.
You're welcome. I mean, I was struggling to find one item that is an important item in your book. It's a macaroon, and the macaroon is is offered to a person that is maybe human, maybe not, or more human. Uh, Briefly, I don't want to derail the conversation right off the bat, but what is a macaroon, Ray? And if the camera can pan over the table, where the wrong macaroons are. Which
Yeah,
macaroon
so
did you have in mind, I should ask?
yes, so we have a distinction in at least in the United States, because I don't know if this exists elsewhere, between a macaroon with two O's, which is a kind of ball of of coconut.
Mhm.
Um, and a macaron, which is the French cookie sort of pastry thing that you see on the table there. So it is actually a macaroon in the book. It's the coconut ball, but apparently those are unavailable in Second Life. So there's an
Yes,
opportunity for someone in the market, right?
absolutely. You got it, Ray. I mean, if you're listening to this and you're like, okay, I didn't have any luck with Second Life business, this is the niche that you got go into the coconut macaroons. Come on. Um, Now we have a little thing that we used to do, which is where we ask people, the guests, to kind of sell their own books as if they are working in a bookstore. And let me change the scenery here real quick. And I would like you to sell me your own book, The Mountain in the Sea. And as I'm getting this up here, I can't grab it right now. Hold on. Here we go. Let's see if that works. There we go. Now look at this. Now we are in an underwater bookshop. And I'm pretending to come to you, to the little bookseller here. And hello, bookseller. How are you?
Hello.
I'm very interested in books that are entertaining, yet also deal with real issues. I'm specifically interested in, broadly speaking, maybe climate fiction.
Okay.
Do you
Well,
like
I
that
have
genre, bookseller? Do you think that you have something that is in that vein? Or maybe you think that
yeah
term is too narrow, maybe?
interested in. Let's see. Are you interested in marine life? Are you interested in the
Yes.
oceans?
Yes,
Oh,
I
okay.
love
Well,
the
I have.
Monterey Bay Aquarium. I love it, and on the Monterey
Ah,
Bay, and yes, I love underwater life. Yes.
excellent. How do you feel about octopuses? And before you answer that, I want you to know that they're listening.
Well, I was very much as a child afraid of octopuses because they have a lot of arms and tentacles, and also as a teenager, I read a lot of H.P. Lovecraft. So the only association that I had with anything that had tentacles was a very negative association. Basically, they're taking over our dimension, and we're all going to die. So I was actually afraid, and that is true. I was afraid of snorkeling for a little while because I felt like if I see that, I'm going to go nuts.
Excellent. Well, maybe this is not the book for you, but
Oh, wait a minute.
but
Here's a bunch of books on the table. You mean the book The Mountain in the Sea by this guy Ronald Nayler?
right. um, so this is a book about. So I guess I would say this is a book for people who like to know not only why things happen, but how. Because for me, when I read a first contact book, quite often what I think is, well, it's all very easy to establish contact with an alien when you get to make the alien up from scratch. It would actually be very difficult to talk to a creature like that. So if you're interested in what the difficulties of communicating with an alien species, maybe one right here on Earth, would be, then this is a book for you. And if you're also interested in discussion of consciousness and what it means to be human, and how we might better treat other creatures on this planet, and how we might better treat the planet itself, this might be for you. If you're interested in some of the sort of burning issues today, like climate change and overfishing of the world's oceans and that kind of thing, this might be for you. And if you're interested in just arguments between security officers and robots over macaroons, this might be a good book for you as well.
Now, you mentioned that but you said it may not be good if I'm afraid of octopuses. Are the octopuses in your book? Sorry, not in your book, in the book by this Ray Naylor person, who is obviously not you because you are a bookseller at this store. Um, are the octopuses in this book, are they evil or good? Are they the evil guys or the good guys of the aliens? Are they the Independence Day aliens or the other kind? Because there's only two kinds, as you know, Ray. Sorry,
Right.
bookseller.
Right. 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 There's only two kinds of anything, right? Good and
Absolutely,
evil.
it's very binary. I live in a
very
very binary world.
that in this book, in fact, there are no fully good people and no fully evil people and no fully good or evil octopuses either.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But they're not also incapable of doing people harm. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm gonna cut here our little improv class. A big round of applause for Ray. If it doesn't work out with the writing career, he can become a bookseller. He just sold me, who was traumatized as a child, a book about octopuses and communicating with them. The book is really amazing, and I mean, again, obviously this was tongue in cheek with good guys and bad guys. It is so fascinating how the main protagonists communicate here with the octopuses. There's one scene where a a person dies, and there is an assumption that the octopuses killed that person because they saw her as a representative of something nefarious. But then it's pretty clear that they killed her because she was just in the way. And talk a little bit about that. It's a big theme in the book is communication and language. Um, and I forgot. I was trying to look for this because I read something recently. And I read so much and I didn't write this down, but somebody said that language itself is already, that's the beginning of the end of limitation, of limiting us. While we would say, well, the more languages the better, the more detailed we can communicate. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, so that talk a little bit about that theme, language and communicating. Um, and assuming that the framework in which the other species lives is exactly our framework.
Well, I think one of the problems that the book looks into is the problem of communication itself and how difficult it is even for people from, well, even for two people who are from the same culture sometimes to communicate in an effective way, and then for two people from completely different cultures or contexts to communicate, and then for two species where you have a physical difference between the two of them to communicate. In the case of an octopus and a human being, for example, you're talking about two creatures that live in completely different mediums. The octopus has no skeleton. It has a completely different body structure. As instead of all of its neurons being located within or extending from its brain, like in a human structure, so all of our neurons originate from inside of our brain and then extend out to our body. Uh, the octopus actually has a ring-like structure around its arms, and a lot of its neurons are outside of its brain. So, in a sense, the octopus is kind of a mind floating
Mm-hmm.
ocean. Its body is suffused with neural connectivity in a way that ours is not. That's a completely different way of looking at the world, right? Instead of all this top-down communication that we're getting from our brain to our body and then from our body backwards, it's getting these sort of circular kinds of communicative um, events. I would say a good metaphor would be being an octopus is probably a lot like what it is like to wake up behind the wheel of your car, right? To
Mm-hmm.
realize that you've been driving for the last 15 or 20 minutes and you have not been paying attention, but that your limbs have been doing what they were supposed to do anyway, and that clearly you've been in control of this vehicle even though your mind was elsewhere.
I
A lot
think,
of
but
people
that's how
fear,
most people drive.
unfortunately. So the octopus, because so many of its neurons are outside of its brain, is sort of exploring its world with thinking limbs that only sometimes are taken over by a central control mechanism,
Mm-hmm.
its brain
Mm-hmm.
itself. And as I said, like when I give you the metaphor of waking up behind the wheel of the car, you understand like what that might be like. Think about that as your sort of base state. You would be mostly kind of unconsciously, physically in the world, and then suddenly you would become alert when there was a problem or something startled you into that state. So there's a kind of that. And but when you're referencing a scene when someone gets killed, the octopus is essentially indifferent to whether that person dies or not.
Yeah,
And I think this is my sort of take on a lot of what human treatment of other creatures is like. It's
absolutely.
not that we are necessarily cruel to them. It's often that we're simply indifferent,
Mm-hmm.
whether they live or die. And so when we kill them, it's out of a sense of total indifference for their well-being, and that's what is uh, happening here. So the octopuses quite simply kill someone because they're in the way. They're
Mm-hmm.
between them and where they want to go, and so they kill them and move on. And that's really the way that human beings have treated the Earth's environment in many ways for a long time now.
And my question was also very broad, of course. By the way, I'm putting up octopus slides here, some pictures. I mean, just magnificent, magnificent animals. And like you said, the brain, the 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 cells are in the tentacles here, and they experience the world completely differently. My broad question was also trying to hint at the fact that the miscommunication is happening between humans, and then also between with this slave ship, with this AI ship, also between people in there. What I find really fascinating, and now I'm going a little bit off script here, but since we're talking about this, the aspect of um, uh, exploiting the ocean, um,
Mhm.
is of course happening at a massive scale in your very sort of close near future. One aspect that I found really fascinating is you mentioned a few times people exploiting their own environments. native people. They're fishing. I mean, they need to survive. And this to me was interesting because I think this is where a book is probably read by different readers in different ways. And I'm currently trying sort of to get a handle on what is going wrong in our economic system. And one of the interesting aspects is that local uh, the local population, the people who just want to survive, are often being blamed for environmental destruction. Oh, look at these people. They don't know what they're doing. They're cutting down these trees, or they're overfishing over there. And then so that this entire blame is often shifted to the individual, again, who is just trying to survive in their native environment, while these huge multinational corporations are destroying the planet on a massive scale. So there's a lot going on here, and you kind of hint at that a little bit here and there, where uh, these park rangers at this park are supposed to take care of the park, but they are stealing turtle eggs to sell them to tourists because their pay is so low, right?
Right.
So
Right.
that is brilliantly woven into this entire texture of the book, I felt, while the action is going on top. But I don't know what you call that. I guess world building. And I think it's very important that that is happening underneath, because we're also talking about a multinational huge corporation that builds AIs and all this kind of stuff, while on the bottom feeders, no pun intended, are just scraping by.
Well, I think the problem that you often have when you're looking at, for example, a local environment, is if you have local people who are subsistence fishing or conducting other activities that are normal to that environment, that might not be harmful. You didn't have outside exploitation of those same resources.
Hmm.
When those resources are already being, damaged by external influences, then the addition of subsistence fishing and the addition of local activities can be the sort of final straw that breaks part of the food chain or helps degrade an ecosystem. And a lot of this is drawn from real life experience, in the sense that I worked on Condal on ecological preservation projects with youth and on awareness projects there. And one of the problems on Condal is things like cyanide fishing by the locals on the reef. But the simple fact is that only about 3,000 people live on the archipelago. Those 3,000
Hmm.
people are not going to completely degrade the ecosystem by themselves, even if
Yep.
they were conducting these illegal activities. What's happening is that boats are coming in and overfishing,
Yep.
and they're overfishing in the waters around the archipelago. And then the impact of local people conducting what would normally be relatively harmless activities becomes more severe. So the problem is, and you see similar problems all over, and especially in these arguments about indigenous cultures and their hunting of things like seal, let's say, for the Inuit in their own environment.
Mhm.
The Inuit have never overfished or overhunted their own environment. The problem is that other people have overfished and overhunted. And
Mhm.
therefore, when the Inuit want to conduct their regular activities, they find that the creatures that used to be there in abundance are now endangered, and their own activities are now capable of possibly endangering them further. But that's
Mhm.
not because of their activities, it's because of those outside influences.
Mhm. And you mentioned Condao. This is where it's happening. Let me put up a slide here. This is a collage of Condao. Um, Now, can you, while we're looking at this, you mentioned conservation, and you did a lot of conservation projects. Uh, what comes to mind, is there, I'm going completely off script, but I need to ask it. Is there such a thing as sustainable seafood at all? Can we eat any seafood? Because I mean, in the book, uh, again, this brutal operation with these AI driven freighters, which is an amazing plot point, where there's these huge freighters. They get all the fish out, and they process them right on the ship, make them into little fish cakes and stuff. And they're not using robots. They're basically using people that they abduct and drug and put on this boat, and they become slaves. And why are they not using robots? Well, because because surplus labor is still sort of ubiquitous. Anyway, so they're doing all this, and I'm reading this, and I'm going like, okay, can I eat any fish? I need to ask Ray, can I
Well,
eat anything?
well, here's the thing: the overfishing, the freighters that are using slave labor, all of those things are not science fiction. All of there's that's one of the sort of side plots of the novel, and that side plot is about what is actually going on right now in our oceans. The only thing that is sort of invented about it is the AI shipping, the AI captain, right?
Hmm.
So the fact that the ship is completely automated, that's the only science fiction or speculative element of this. The rest of it is actually drawn from the oral histories of enslaved people on fishing
Hmm.
vessels. And if you want to talk about massive, fishing vessels, there was one last week parked just off of offshore, right outside of the exclusive zone of the UK, near Cork, um, and just literally hoovering up tons and tons of aquatic life. Right?
Mm.
It's this gigantic factory and processing ship. So these monsters are actually really out there right now. Do you eat fish
I do.
sustainably? I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
it's a really good question. I would say that right now, given what's happening, and given that you don't really know where your fish is coming from,
Mhm.
even though you might think you do or hope that you do, probably not. Probably
Mhm.
ethically, you cannot, because you just can't see to the bottom of where this industrial chain is going. I would say, is there a sustainable way to use the ocean and to take fish from the ocean? Yes, there is. We're not there.
Mhm.
And that's not what's happening right now. What's happening right now is that the human race is degrading the ability of the ocean to replenish itself and its
Mhm.
own stocks of fish. And we're degrading it the same way that we've been degrading the rest of the environment on the planet. I'm sorry if nobody wants to hear that, but it's a fact. We kill, just one example, we kill about 100 million sharks a year, mostly for their fins. Sharks kill 10 people a year,
Mhm.
10 to 11 people on average. So that's, just to keep it clear, that's 10 million sharks for every person. What I'd like to ask you is, if you're super afraid of sharks, imagine how afraid of people sharks should be, right? I
Right.
mean, we're the
Right.
monsters.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I threw a lot together here. Let's the what I hear you say about seafood is basically that if I were to live in a certain ocean vicinity, and I have done that traditionally just to feed me and my family, then I could probably continue to do that in good conscience. But if I live in continental Europe and go down to the grocery store and look at uh, whatever biologically wild salmon from whatever humanely killed, I should
Right.
probably not do that.
There might be some ways if you very very carefully researched what you were eating. I think there's some, you could probably find some sustainable things, but you should be very careful about how things are labeled, etc. And I mean, one thing that you need to keep in mind is that, yes, I saw someone's comment about how there are closed seasons and all that, yada yada yada. That's true. Most of the ocean is the high seas, and the high seas are completely uncontrolled, and nobody has to listen to anyone else's laws out there, and that is where most of the fishing is going on. It's
Hmm.
in those high seas. The high seas are still complete anarchy. That's why I'm saying there was that giant fishing vessel parked right outside the UK's exclusive economic zone, which is where it controls how much can be fished, draining the ocean of life, right? That's what happens. Most of this world is not under any sort of legal control by anyone.
The resistor here says in commercial fishing in the Mediterranean, squid are traditionally killed by repeatedly hitting their coat sack vigorously on a solid surface, often on stones in the harbor. So moving from the brutality of this business to the beauty of the setting of the story, these the Condau archipelago, and there's a slide up if the camera can zoom in a little bit. It's a little dark there in the back. Let me bring up the lights. What about this setting was important to you to set it there?
So as I said, I worked on some conservation projects out on the archipelago. I absolutely fell in love with the Condau archipelago, and I had a very powerful experience there, which was probably where the kind of core of this book was born. I was out on the archipelago working on this project, and I got a phone call from my grandmother early in the morning telling me that my grandfather was dying, that I should try to get back to the United States as quickly as I could. Now, keep in mind, I was on an archipelago that has one flight a day, in and out on a very small prop plane. And so I tried to get off the island. The flights had been canceled because of some wind, which was pretty common. So I was sort of stuck there. And then I got a call several hours later telling me that my grandfather anyway had passed away, and so there was no reason for me to leave. And that same day, I was supposed to go on my first night dive. And so I decided I might as well go ahead with things since I couldn't change anything that had happened. We went out on this boat. We waited for the sun to set and for it to get dark, and then we all got in the water. And night diving might sound terrifying to people, but I assure you that actually it's really not. Mm-hmm. You're so focused on what is in the beam of your flashlight, and what you're looking at is so interesting underwater that you completely forget about the rest of the world. And so it was sort of a perfect activity to be doing, because it completely took my mind off of all of my other troubles. And while I was diving, this little juvenile cuttlefish came in to my beam, and it was so young. It was only about the size probably of my thumb or a little bit larger, so young that it was still transparent, so you could see all of its like internal organs and structures, but it also still had the ability to make shapes and colors on its translucent skin. And in the beam of my light, it was like the only way I could describe it is it was like a tiny party boat, kind of zipping around back and forth, making shapes with its limbs and coming up close to my mask and swimming off and then coming back to look at me again. And it was clearly trying to interact with me. It was curious about me. It wanted to see what I was doing. It was exploring its young world, right? Cuttlefish live for a very short time, most of them only a season. So it has very little time to be curious about its world and explore, and it intensely explores the world while it's alive. And it was this neat sort of communicative experience, and I think that's kind of where the kernel of the idea for the novel happens. So the novel really is about, it's not about entirely all this tragedy that's happening to an environment. It's also about the beauty of that world of Condau and the archipelago, of our place in the world and what it could be, and of interaction with other animals, and what a rewarding experience that can be for people. So I don't want people to get the idea that this is some kind of completely dystopic novel. I really think that it is not.
No, actually, absolutely. And thanks for saying this, because I want to make also sure that people understand, and what I really love about this book. There are big problems of this brutal exploitative capitalism. There are these big corporations, but there are such good human beings, and some almost human or more than human good people trying to do really, really good things in their own way. And you asked me about the ending yesterday on email, where I said I'm not gonna read the end. I think the end is really quite brilliant. It is open. It is hopeful. There are possibilities, and that's precisely what I talked about in a talk last week with Kat Sparks from Australia about this sort of slew of dystopian, and this is not a new phenomenon, but dystopian novels that just, that are fast moving and nice, comfort food, in the sense of like, okay, hits all the points that I want, and there's action in it, but they're ultimately, uh, they don't leave room for imagining a better world. And I think Cory Doctorow has written a lot about this, and other people have spoken about this too, that when you write this, and when you consume these types of stories, they may be satisfying in the moment, but ultimately they cement a worldview that we are stuck in this, and there's no way um, that we can get out of it. It's just like, you're sitting on the Titanic and you're reading dystopian novels. It goes like, okay, the iceberg is coming closer, but at least, I'm reading novels about how the iceberg is going to kill me and everybody else. And you're not
Right,
doing
right.
this with this book. I mean, what's your take on that kind of, I don't know, these stylistic choices? And then follow-up question: how anxiety inducing is coming up with an ending?
So I think that, first of all, short of a meteor of enormous size striking planet Earth and liquefying all of the surface of it and turning it back into a ball of fire that has to recoalesce into a planet again, nothing is really going to wipe out the human race completely. And so a lot of these ideas of the end of the human race are false to begin with. What we are capable of doing is degrading our environment and making life more unpleasant for the people who come here after us. There will be more war, there will be more conflict, there will be less uh, variety on the planet, there will be fewer species, there will be less good things to eat, see, and do, and life will be less enjoyable. And that is not what we want for our children. The question that we should be asking ourselves, really, we should be taking the future seriously. We should be realizing that there are going to be people here in 100 years. There are going to be people here in 1,000 years, in 10,000 years. The question we should be asking ourselves is, are we being good ancestors? Are we doing what we should be doing for our children, our children's children, and all of the people that are going to have to live in this place after us? Or are we exhausting this planet's resources selfishly and pretending that they don't exist when they do? And the thing is that dystopia allows us to really sit and mire ourselves in this idea that we are in this end time.
Yep,
We
exactly.
are not in an end time. There will be a time when we are all forgotten, the same way that the Byzantine emperors that you cannot name were forgotten, right? Even more so. No one will know any of our names except for a few, salient like points that they might have to study for a quiz. And that time is going to come in several hundred years or
Mhm.
1,000 years. But there's going to be a human world here 10,000 years from now. What we need to be thinking is, like, just how selfish are we that in these few generations from the 19th century, this 21st century that we're in right now, we sucked up all of these resources and caused the extinction of so many of the other species on this planet. How are they going to remember us? What kind of legacy are we leaving? So the real question for me is, what could we do now together to make this world a better place? People who come after, because isn't our desire always that the world continues to get better for the people who live in it and for everyone else, meaning all of the animals and plants that live in it as well, right?
Mhm.
And I think that it's not that dystopias aren't fun to read, because they are, but they're fundamentally disempowering.
Yep.
So what I think we need to look at is what do we do as the world gets worse to make sure that it doesn't, and how do we work together to reverse this trend?
If you're just tuning in, or if you're just showing up here, there's a bunch of more people just came in. Welcome. This is the Second Life Book Club, and our guest today is Ray Nayler and his amazing novel, debut novel, after a whole bunch of short stories, is The Mountain in the Sea. And it's interesting. My wife wrote a paper recently about Emmanuel Levinas, and he came to mind. And I didn't know who he was. He's a French philosopher. I put up a slide here, 1906 to 1995, and he was talking about that the other is unknowable. And I'm not an expert on him at all. I just looked over my wife's shoulder and read her paper, and we talked about Levinas a little bit, and that he came to mind when I read Ray's book, and also what you're talking about now, Ray, is because we do not know the other person. Levinas is referring to another human being, but we don't know other species, and so the course of action that Levinas is prescribing here is a course of really utter empathy and understanding and not assuming anything about that other person. And that really
Mhm.
comes across in your book through these main characters. Um, I call them the two docs, Dr. Hawin and Dr. and I'm looking at my sheet, Aaron Cutler, Minervu dot
Never daughter Chan.
Minerva daughter John. God. But yeah, so talk a little bit about the the empathy and the unknowable. I mean, we talked about it at the beginning of the hour. We're talking about language. Now we're talking about octopus and assuming the humans are assuming certain things about them. How can we? What can people take away from your book in terms of maybe dealing with our fellow human beings in a more empathetic way? I'm assuming that may be a little bit of your hope. I
Yeah,
read that between the lines.
let me start from another place. So other is unknowable. I think that's an interesting starting point, but I would counter with something that's even more interesting, which is that the self is also unknowable.
Mhm.
And one really good way that this was demonstrated was during these split brain experiments. You remember they had these experiments where they had to, some people had to have their brains surgically disconnected, the two hemispheres, in order to stop these massive seizures that they were having. This was the only way to stop the seizures from, they were crossing those two hemispheres and causing this just electrical cacophony in the brain that was causing these grand mal seizures. Once those two hemispheres were separated, the brain function largely did not change in those people, which was a bit of a surprise for the surgeons. It also created an opportunity for people to study the human brain's hemispheres and the difference between them. One of the studies is really interesting. So they found out that the visual and vocal centers, for example, the vocal center is located in one hemisphere, and so essentially what you could do is you could cover one eye, right, and
Mhm.
show the other eye a piece of paper, and have it read something from that paper, and in this way you could communicate with only one hemisphere of the brain. So here's what they would do: they would sit a person down who had this split brain surgery done to them, and they would hold a piece of paper in front of one eye with the other eye covered and say, "Go buy a soda from the machine in front of you." The person would stand up and go put a quarter in the machine and buy a soda. They would sit back down and be drinking the soda. They would then ask they would cover the other eye, and they would ask the question on the piece of paper, "Why did you buy that soda?" And the vocal response the person would give was, "I was thirsty."
Mhm.
Right? Now that's clearly not why they would buy the soda. And then they would
Mhm.
ask different hemispheres of the brain. For example, they would ask the dominant hemisphere, "Well, what did you want to be when you were a kid?" And dominant hemisphere would say, I wanted to be a doctor. And they would ask the other hemisphere, what did you want to be when you were a kid? And he would say, and that hemisphere would say, a priest or an artist. And
Wow.
so I would suggest that the split brain experiments showed that not only is the other fundamentally unknowable in many ways, but we are unknowable.
Mhm.
We're a mystery just below the surface of our conscious mind, even to ourselves. And so if we start from the idea that we really don't know much about anyone or anything in the world, and we certainly don't know what they mean, and we instead try to use empathy to put ourselves in their position, we see that actually this is something that is core to communication. And I can sort of prove this to you. So we conduct, those of us who have pets conduct interspecies acts of communication
All the
multiple
time.
times a day,
Yeah.
all the time. You have an animal that lives in your house that tells you things about what it needs and what it wants, and you understand those things that it tells you. You give those things to the animal, and you tell that animal things, and it understands you, and it will sometimes, do the things that you want it to do, unless it's a cat, in which case it will largely not. But it still understands what you wanted. It just doesn't do it. But what I'm saying is, in this sort of joking way, is we talk to animals all the time. People who work with horses understand that they have a language with horses, right? That they speak to horses and horses understand them. We communicate with animals. We don't have symbolic communication. We don't, co-write uh, essays with them because they don't engage in symbolic communication. But we do communicate with animals all the time, and we also communicate all the time with animals that we don't know. So we communicate with birds, for example. The birds sense what we're doing and our signals. They know when we have bread that we might give them, for example, and stock our picnics, right? They watch us from afar when we fill their bird feeders. I have a bird feeder on my balcony, and I've noticed that the birds in the tree across from our house have a call that they give when I'm refilling the bird feeder.
Hmm.
While I'm refilling the bird feeder, the birds are telling each other, "Oh, he's out giving us fresh food again. Wait 5 minutes and then let's go have a feast." And indeed, they do. Right? So we engage in these communicative acts, and we do understand other people, even though we don't know them completely. We do this through empathy, and a really good example of how this backfires, right, is how the lack of empathy equals a lack of communication. Is just look at the way that social media often operates, right? Way
Mm.
in which people will say things and do things to strangers on the internet that they never would do to a person who was sitting in front of them, who
I
they were eating a
remember they
meal with.
were, yeah, and they were calling this the disinhibition effect. And it's interesting because the founder of Second Life, Philip Rosedale, gave a lot of talks about this, and his theory is that in virtual reality or virtual worlds, this would be lessened because we are actually in the presence of other people represented by an